I never believed in curses, legends, or any of that supernatural nonsense. My job as a federal agent took me to strange places, but I always had faith that there was a logical explanation for everything. In 1982, though, I was sent to rural Louisiana, where logic met its limit. It was late summer, the humidity thick enough to cut through. I was assigned to investigate a string of drownings that had taken place in the remote swamp towns around Bayou Noir. 5 men, all fit, capable swimmers, had vanished near the same isolated stretch of swamp. Only their bodies were found, waterlogged and lifeless, tangled in the roots of a tree the locals called the Screaming Oak. My arrival in Bayou Noir was met with wary glances. Folks here were suspicious of outsiders, but there was something different in their eyes when I asked about the drownings. They didn't just look at me with caution, there was something like pity in their expressions, almost like they thought I was already doomed. An elderly man named Jeb, who ran the local bait shop, seemed willing to talk. His hands trembled as he handed me a small leather pouch with herbs and beads sewn onto it. "Take it," he said in a thick Creole accent. "Keeps the spirits at bay." I couldn't hide my skepticism, but his serious gaze left no room for argument. I stuffed it in my pocket, figuring it was easier than refusing. I made my way down to the docks, where a weathered motorboat waited for me. The air felt different here, charged with a heaviness that sank deeper as I motored out into the heart of the swamp. The boat's engine droned as I navigated through dark waters under a canopy of twisted cypress trees, their roots dipping into the black water like bony fingers. Occasionally, I'd spot old fishing boats adrift, some with deep gashes on their sides, as though they'd been clawed by something much larger than any creature I knew to exist in these waters. It was then I first heard a low, moaning sound that reverberated through the trees. It sounded almost human, like a cry of anguish muffled by the dense foliage. I shut off the engine, trying to pinpoint the direction. The air grew still, too still. The familiar sounds of the swamp, croaking frogs, buzzing insects faded into silence. I floated there, holding my breath. For a long moment, nothing happened, and I began to wonder if I was just hearing things. Then it came again, a scream, piercing and ragged, rising and falling like a desperate, trapped animal. It sounded like it came from somewhere just ahead, deeper into the thick swamp. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity or maybe arrogance kept me moving forward. I inched through the water, my gaze fixed on the dense curtain of trees. And then, through a gap in the foliage, I saw the Screaming Oak. It towered over the other trees, its massive trunk gnarled and twisted, with roots that looked like claws gripping the earth. The branches stretched wide and low, as if the tree itself was trying to reach out and grab anyone who came too close. I could see something carved into the bark, symbols I couldn't recognize, but they looked old, like they'd been etched there centuries ago. The screaming grew louder as I approached, filling the air with a haunting resonance that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I stepped out of the boat, onto the muddy bank, and felt a chill despite the thick heat. With each step toward the tree, I could feel a pull, like an invisible force dragging me closer. As I reached out, something cold brushed against my hand, a wisp of mist, swirling up from the roots. The mist thickened, rising from the ground, and before I knew it, I was enveloped in it. It felt heavy, suffocating, like a damp cloth pressed over my face. I tried to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Through the haze, I caught sight of a figure emerging from the swamp, a shapeless mass, dark and shifting, like smoke curling up from a fire. It had no defined features, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. The scream rose to an unbearable pitch, filling my head, rattling through my skull until I could barely think. I stumbled backward, desperate to break free from whatever was holding me. My hands clawed at my ears, but the sound only grew louder, digging into my mind like sharp nails. Finally, I managed to pull myself away, collapsing onto the floor of the boat. I cranked the engine with shaking hands, not daring to look back as I sped away from the Screaming Oak. The wailing followed me, echoing through the swamp, even as the tree disappeared from view. When I returned to Bayou Noir, I tried to explain what had happened, but my words felt inadequate, even to me. Jeb just shook his head, his eyes filled with that same pity. I left Louisiana soon after, but the scream never left me. I'd hear it sometimes, in the dead of night, echoing in my mind like a distant memory I couldn't shake. Even now, miles away and years later, I still hear it haunting, relentless, as if the screaming oak is calling me back, waiting for the day I'll finally answer. In 1981, I was a young Forest Service ranger stationed in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. The landscape here was familiar to me, a place I'd grown to know as well as my own backyard, the dense trees, the crisp air, the mist rolling through every morning like a second skin over the mountains. The quiet out here was something I cherished. But that quiet had changed recently. Just a few days before, a ranger named Mark had gone missing. He'd been tracking poachers along the trails, combing through the thickest parts of the forest, well beyond where the tourists wandered. His last radio transmission had been short, almost hurried, "I think I see something," and then silence. The morning he didn't report back, the rest of the team began to worry. Mark was experienced, a solid, steady guy, not the type to get lost or spooked. So, they called me, one of the most seasoned trackers around, to find him. I packed my bag, double-checked my knife, and loaded up with enough food and water to last a couple of days. As I stepped into the forest, the usual sense of peace was absent. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. The locals around here called it the Howling Pines. I'd always thought it was just an eerie name, one of those nicknames people use to make the place sound more mysterious than it really is. But they talked about a spirit, a monstrous wolf that hunted at night, prowling the forest. I never gave it much thought until that day. Hours went by as I tracked. I could make out the faint scuff marks on the ground, the bent grass, broken twigs, signs of Mark's path. It was quiet, almost too quiet. As I moved deeper, the trees began to thicken, crowding together like they were hiding something. Then I saw Mark's ranger hat, lying beside a large, dark patch on the ground. Kneeling down, I reached out to touch it, and my fingers came away sticky. Blood, fresh. A chill prickled the back of my neck. I scanned the area, expecting to see some sign of a struggle, some hint of what had happened. But there was nothing, just the hat, the blood, and silence. I felt a low rumble, like a growl, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The mist was starting to creep in, swirling around my ankles, dampening the sound of my footsteps. The deeper I went, the thicker the fog became. It felt suffocating, like it was wrapping itself around me, urging me to turn back. But I pressed on, calling out softly for Mark, even though I knew I'd get no answer. As the hours passed, I began to feel something, a presence. It was as though something was watching me, tracking me just as I was tracking Mark. The mist hung heavy, but through the shifting fog, I thought I saw movement, a hulking shadow slipping between the trees, too large to be a deer or a bear. And then, the snap of a branch. I froze, heart pounding. It came closer, a massive shape moving with an eerie, unnatural grace, almost gliding through the mist. I could barely make it out, but I knew one thing: it wasn't human. It was something wild, something that didn't belong to this world. I could see its eyes, glowing a dull amber through the fog. My breath caught in my throat as the figure began circling, each step silent, but leaving claw marks on the trees, deep and fresh. A primal fear surged through me. I wanted to turn and run, but something held me there, like I was trapped in a nightmare where I couldn't control my own body. The figure stepped closer, just close enough for me to make out the hulking form of a wolf, but larger than any wolf I'd ever seen, almost as tall as a man. Its fur was dark, matted, like it was soaked in shadows, and its eyes, those eyes were filled with something that felt like intelligence, a knowing, predatory gaze that seemed to see straight through me. I stumbled back, snapping out of my daze, and scrambled to get away. I could feel it following, silent but ever present, never letting me out of its sight. Every so often, I'd glance back, catching a glimpse of those amber eyes through the trees, watching, waiting. My heart was racing, my breath shallow as I fought through the branches and brambles, desperate to escape. When I finally broke free of the dense woods and reached the ranger station, I was covered in scratches, my clothes torn, and my hand trembling as I shut the door behind me. But the strangest thing was the claw marks on my arm, deep red but not bleeding. They felt like they were branded onto my skin, a reminder of the thing I'd seen. I don't talk about it often. The team wrote off Mark's disappearance as a wild animal attack, and I let them. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I swear I can still feel those amber eyes watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting for the day I come back into its territory. And maybe one day I will, whether I want to or not. It was a bitterly cold January morning in 1986, and the snow was relentless, blanketing every visible inch of the Montana mountain range. The peaks were sharp and daunting, with white expanses stretching endlessly, giving the mountains an eerie, empty feeling. The crisp air felt almost untouched, as if humans rarely passed through this far-flung wilderness. I was part of a small search and rescue unit tasked with finding 2 snowshoers who'd gone missing near a remote peak. According to the locals, they were experienced outdoorsmen, so it was strange they'd simply vanished without a trace. The mission itself seemed straightforward, but as we got closer to the range, something felt. The locals had told us strange tales, rumors of a spectral figure that haunted these ridges, a vengeful spirit of a cannibalistic mountain man who legend claimed had turned on his friends during a harsh winter long ago. Supposedly, he'd lost his mind, gnawing on bones to survive, and his ghost was cursed to wander these mountains ever since. I brushed off the stories. Every small town has its legends, right? I chalked it up to superstition and figured we'd find the snowshoers hunkered down in some snow cave or waiting out the storm. I was one of 2 agents who volunteered to search higher up the mountain, where the last tracks were reported. My partner, Dave, was a big, burly guy and a local who knew the trails like the back of his hand. The trail was steep, and as we climbed, the wind picked up, howling like some distant, angry animal. It felt unnaturally cold, as though something was draining the warmth out of the air. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on following the faint tracks we'd found in the snow. We hadn't been climbing for more than a couple of hours when we stumbled upon our first strange discovery, a half-eaten deer carcass. The snow around it was stained dark, and the meat was ragged and torn as if something with sharp teeth had been at it. But the strangest part was the footprints. Massive claw marks surrounded the body, trailing off into the trees in a way that didn't match any animal I knew of. Dave and I exchanged a look, but said nothing, pushing forward with quiet determination. The hours passed slowly, and as the light began to fade, everything grew eerily still. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of our boots in the snow. Then, as we crested a small ridge, we heard a faint, scraping sound, almost like nails on metal. We stopped dead, scanning the area around us, but there was nothing visible, just snow-covered trees and rocks. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Dave nodded, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. He was usually calm, collected, but right then, I could see he was as unnerved as I was. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from the trees behind us. We spun around, but again, nothing. Just the quiet, unsettling emptiness of the mountain. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a shadow. A tall, thin, skeletal figure, barely visible through the trees, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It darted between the pines, its limbs impossibly long and twisted, like it was made of jagged bones and sinew. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen. Dave grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance, and we started to back away, slow at first, then faster. But as we moved, the figure moved with us, closing the distance. It moved in sharp, jerky motions, each step sending a jolt of terror through my body. I could barely breathe, my heart hammering in my chest as we stumbled down the ridge. As we neared the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time, and that's when I saw its face, or rather, what was left of it. Its skin was stretched tight, almost translucent over a skull-like face, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow our every move. Its mouth was open, wider than any human mouth should be, with sharp, broken teeth glinting in the moonlight. And it was smiling. I'll never forget that smile. We ran, faster than I thought possible, down the mountain and back to base camp. Neither of us spoke a word, and the entire time I could feel it, the cold. It wasn't the same cold as the snow or the wind. It was a deep, piercing cold that felt like it was coming from inside me, as if something had touched my soul and left a mark. We never found those snowshoers? The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, likely due to hypothermia or a fall. But I know what we saw up there. Sometimes, late at night, I can still feel that same cold creeping into my bones, and I wake up with the image of that smiling, skeletal face burned into my mind. No one believes me, of course, but every time the winter wind howls, I can't help but wonder if that thing is still out there, lurking in the snow, waiting for its next victim. It was the summer of 1983, and my assignment was simple enough on paper: locate Dr. Robert Morrow, an archaeologist with a passion for Native American history and a penchant for wandering off the grid. He'd gone missing somewhere in the Black Hills of South Dakota, a region known for its dense forests, rugged terrain, and whispered legends. I wasn't one for stories, especially not local ghost tales, but when you're alone in an unfamiliar land, it's hard not to pay attention. I wasn't alone, of course not technically. I had a radio, my supplies, and a map marked with the last known coordinates of Dr. Morrow's campsite. The weather was calm, and as I started my hike, the thick trees provided ample shade, though they cast long shadows even at midday. It was the kind of place where sound didn't carry far, and the silence felt thick, like it was listening. I was only a few hours into my hike when I first noticed something odd. A tree, not particularly large or remarkable at first, bore a mark. It looked like a rough carving, lines etched deeply into the bark, in a way that didn't seem like mere vandalism. It was a symbol of some sort, a crude, spiral shape with branching lines. It looked old, worn into the wood over time. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just one of those things that might make more sense the closer I got to Morrow's site. I continued on, but the carvings didn't stop. Every so often I'd pass another tree with another symbol. They seemed random at first, but soon I realized they were leading me somewhere, almost like a path. As I got closer to the coordinates, things became stranger. The carvings were joined by what looked like old artifacts scattered on the ground, small animal bones, feathers arranged in patterns, stones stacked in odd formations. They didn't look like natural piles someone had placed them there. I felt an uneasy thrill. It wasn't every day you stumbled upon a mystery, even one as quiet and unassuming as this. Then, as I neared Morrow's campsite, I heard something. It was faint, so faint I almost thought I imagined it a whisper, like the wind catching on something deep within the trees. The air felt different here, heavier. My skin prickled as I scanned my surroundings, half expecting to see Morrow step out of the trees, smiling at his discovery. But there was nothing. I finally found his tent. It was still there, though the fabric had been shredded in places, the zipper hanging loosely as if it had been roughly tugged. Morrow's belongings were scattered, but it didn't look like an animal had torn through them. It looked like someone had been searching, desperate, hurried. In the fading light, I noticed something else near the tent. More carvings, but this time they were etched into the rocks, surrounding the area like some kind of warning. I was about to call in the find when I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. Not the kind you could mistake for an animal scurrying through the brush. I froze, every instinct telling me not to turn around, but curiosity or maybe fear got the better of me. I turned, just a quick glance over my shoulder. And there it was, standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched and twisted in ways that felt wrong. Hollow, dark eyes bore into me from a face that was more bone than flesh. My breath hitched as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the shadows, but it moved, and when it did, I saw its eyes tracking me. For a long moment we stared at each other, neither moving. My heart pounded, my hands slowly inching to my radio, but I knew even if I called for help, no one would reach me in time. And then, as though dismissing me, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait around to see where it went. Grabbing my gear, I stumbled away, my mind blank except for the need to run. I wasn't even sure I was heading in the right direction. I tripped, falling down a slope and landing hard against a rock. Dizzy, scraped, I forced myself up, ignoring the pain in my leg. I didn't stop until I was clear of the tree line, panting and disoriented, the sun nearly gone. Only then did I dare to look back. The shadows moved, but I saw nothing there. Nothing except the faint feeling of being watched, as though the darkness itself held eyes. I reported Morrow as lost, even though deep down I knew he wasn't coming back. In the years since, I sometimes catch glimpses of shadows where they shouldn't be, and in the silence I swear I can hear a faint whisper, calling my name. Some nights, I see those hollow eyes staring back at me in my dreams, waiting, as if they know I'll return to that place someday. It was the summer of 1985, in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. I'd been working as a field agent for a small branch of the National Park Service for a few years by then. Officially, my duties revolved around wildlife conservation, monitoring animal populations, and guiding wayward hikers back to civilization. Unofficially, I was occasionally sent out on stranger assignments that were better left off the books. That's how I ended up camping on the edge of an abandoned military base, alone, in the middle of the desert. I remember the brief I'd been handed just a few days earlier. It was vague, which wasn't unusual. Unusual deaths in the southwestern quadrant, disappearance of campers, sightings of an unidentified entity. The higher-ups wanted answers, or at the very least, confirmation of what had taken place. My job was to collect data, record any signs of wildlife that might account for the attacks, and document anything unusual. But I was warned not to dig too deep. 2 campers had vanished only days before I arrived, and their bodies had been found shortly after, one lying face down near an old jeep, skin nearly blackened from exposure, and the other further out, his clothes torn and half buried in sand. The authorities chalked it up to heat stroke and animal scavenging, but I could tell there was more to it. They wouldn't have sent me if it were just a matter of overconfident tourists getting lost. The desert was vast, stretching out in every direction like a rolling sea of cracked, dry earth and wiry brush. I had parked my old Bronco at the edge of the military base, just beside a rusted chain-link fence that stretched for miles around. Inside, it was nothing but gutted buildings and piles of scrap metal remnants of something that had once been important and was now long forgotten. As the sun set, I set up camp just outside the fence, hoping to cover some ground early the next morning. I'd brought along my standard issue equipment: a flashlight, radio, map, and a worn notebook to jot down anything unusual. I knew better than to expect my radio to pick up much out here, but I kept it on anyway, just for a little comfort. By midnight, the silence was so thick I could feel it pressing down on me. It's the kind of silence you only get in the desert, where even the wind seems to be holding its breath. I lay in my tent, listening, my senses sharp in a way they only got on missions like these. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was alert, that primal sense of caution kicking in as the hours dragged on. Then, somewhere in the darkness, I heard it, a voice. It was faint, almost swallowed up by the stillness, but unmistakable, someone calling out. I sat up, straining to hear, and my pulse quickened. It was a man's voice, deep and drawn out, as if he were calling from far away. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The desert stretched out like a shadowy wasteland under the moonlight, and I scanned the horizon, looking for movement. But there was nothing, just the endless sand and sagebrush. "Hey," I called out, my own voice sounding strange in the quiet. "Is someone out there?" For a moment, there was only silence. I began to wonder if I'd imagined it, maybe the sound of the wind playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it again, the same voice, clearer this time. "Help! Help me!" It was weak, barely above a whisper, but I could tell it was close. Too close. My mind raced as I tried to piece together where it could be coming from. I swept my flashlight over the ground, searching for footprints or signs of movement, but there was nothing. Just endless sand and the dark shapes of rocks scattered across the landscape. The voice came again, even softer this time, almost pleading. "Help, please." I tried to follow the sound, but every time I took a step, it seemed to drift further away. It was as if the voice was moving, calling out from somewhere just beyond my reach. My skin prickled with unease, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the shadows. I turned back toward the base, aiming my flashlight at the rusted fence, the abandoned buildings looming like silent sentinels. The voice was still there, echoing in the darkness, calling out with that same haunting plea. And that's when I noticed something strange. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. "Help. Please," it was my voice. It was the summer of 1987 when I first found myself in the quiet, weather-worn village of Greyport, a small fishing town on the coast of Maine. To an outsider, the place didn't look like much. Rows of modest homes with peeling paint, boats bobbing lazily along the docks, and a lighthouse that looked like it hadn't been repainted since the 1930s. The smell of salt, seaweed, and fish hung thick in the air, and the villagers, though polite, didn't give much away. They were wary of newcomers, and it felt as if every word spoken was carefully chosen. I wasn't there on vacation. I'd come because of a string of disappearances that had been quietly unsettling the town. 3 fishermen had vanished within the past year, their boats found drifting empty in the harbor, nets abandoned and half draped over the side. I'd been sent by the state to look into things and see if there was any link between the disappearances. I'd heard the rumors, of course, the whispers of the widow's wail, an old legend about a woman who drowned 100 years ago and was said to haunt the shores, luring men to a watery grave. The first few days went by quietly. I questioned the locals, some of whom gave me stories of strange whistles and cries carried over the wind, sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Others had seen strange things in the fog, shapes shifting in the mist like half-formed shadows. It sounded like typical seaside superstition, the kind of folklore that crops up in every small town near the water. But even as I brushed it off, there was something about Greyport that made me uneasy. I'd been to plenty of small towns, but there was an air here, thick and heavy, that made it hard to sleep at night. It wasn't until the third night that I heard it. I was staying in a small room above the only tavern in town, the kind of place that had probably changed little since the 1940s. I'd been up late, going over my notes by the dim light of a lamp. Around midnight, I finally turned off the light and lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the creak of the old building settling. And that's when I heard it, a faint whistling drifting up through the open window. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was different. The sound was steady, with a melody, hauntingly slow. I couldn't make out any words, but there was a rhythm to it, like a lullaby. The hairs on my arms prickled as I lay there, motionless, listening. I told myself it was just one of the fishermen heading out early, but the sound didn't fade, it stayed steady, almost as if it was circling my window, calling me. Against my better judgment, I got up and went to the window. The street below was empty, the cobblestones slick from a recent rain. The docks were visible in the distance, dimly lit by the moonlight, but I saw no one there, no shadow of a figure or sign of movement. Just that eerie, endless whistling, hanging in the air like smoke. The next morning, I asked around, mentioning the whistling to a few of the locals. They gave me strange looks, exchanged glances, and muttered something about the widow's wail. They told me, in hushed voices, that if you heard her whistling, it meant she was calling you. Some said the only way to escape her was to leave Greyport and never come back. Others told me to stay inside after dark and never, ever answer if I heard her voice. I brushed it off as local superstition again, but there was something in their eyes that I couldn't shake, a real, deep-seated fear that seemed older than the town itself. Over the next few nights, the whistling grew louder. It would start around midnight, drifting up through the silence, filling my room with that haunting, melancholy melody. And every night, it felt closer, as if it was slowly circling, drawing me in. I tried to ignore it, to bury myself in my work, but the more I ignored it, the more persistent it became. By the fifth night, I could have sworn the whistling was coming from right outside my door. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on a jacket, and made my way down the creaking stairs and out into the cold night air. The village was quiet, eerily so, and the fog was thick, rolling in from the sea and hanging low over the ground like a shroud. I followed the whistling, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, the sound growing louder and more mournful with every step. The trail led me down to the docks, where the boats swayed gently in the water, their masts creaking softly. I scanned the shoreline, my flashlight cutting through the fog, but I saw no one, just the empty boats and the endless whistling. Then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the dock, her figure barely visible through the thick fog. Her hair was long, dripping with water, clinging to her face, and her eyes were empty, hollow, like dark pools. She was watching me, her lips moving in tune with the whistling, though no sound came from her mouth. I froze, unable to move, my heart pounding as I met her gaze. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in that terrible silence. And then, without a sound, she lifted her arm and pointed out toward the sea. I don't remember much after that. I must have run, stumbling back through the fog, barely able to see where I was going. When I finally reached my room, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, shaking. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when dawn finally broke, I packed my things and left Greyport without a word. But it didn't end there. Even now, years later, I still hear her sometimes. I'll be sitting by a pond or walking along a quiet river, and out of nowhere, that familiar, haunting whistling will drift over the water, soft and slow, just like it did in Greyport. I know it's impossible that she couldn't have followed me all this way, but every time I hear it, I feel that same chill, that same sense of being watched. And I wonder if one day I'll turn around and see her again, standing there with those hollow eyes waiting. In the summer of 1984, the Appalachian Hills were alive with the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. I had been working for the Forest Service for a few years by then, getting used to the solitude and the oddities that came with it. When the call came in about 2 missing hikers near an abandoned mining town, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Missing people didn't just vanish into thin air, but in the shadowy corners of the Appalachians, it felt all too possible. The hikers, both in their 20s, had ventured out a few days earlier, armed with nothing more than enthusiasm and a vague idea of their route. They were last seen near the old mine, speaking about strange fog that rolled in unexpectedly. That mine, a crumbling relic from a long-gone era, was rumored to be haunted. Locals whispered tales of miners trapped in a collapse decades ago, their souls unable to find peace. I had heard the stories, of course, but they had never resonated with me. Ghosts were for campfire tales, not for serious work. Still, there was an urgency to the situation. The Forest Service wanted someone on it quickly, and since I was the closest, I had no choice but to accept the assignment. I packed my gear with a mix of determination and apprehension. I threw in a flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and some water, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease. I also grabbed a radio, knowing I'd need to keep in contact. Then I set off early the next morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the misty hills. The trail to the mine was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost oppressive. The trees lined the path like sentinels, tall and watchful, their leaves whispering secrets to one another. I could hear the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rhythm of my steps the only sound to break the stillness. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, a sense of dread began to creep in, tightening its grip around my chest. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I finally arrived at the mine, I was met with a sight that sent a shiver down my spine. The entrance loomed before me like a dark, gaping mouth in the earth, jagged and foreboding. Thick fog curled around the opening, rolling in like a living creature. The air smelled damp and earthy, heavy with the scent of decay. I hesitated for a moment, my flashlight barely breaking through the dense mist that clung to the ground. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. I was here to find those hikers, to make sense of what had happened. As I stepped forward, the fog seemed to thicken, swirling around my legs like a sinister fog that wanted to keep me from entering. Just inside the mouth of the mine, I spotted something half buried in the dirt, an old pickaxe, rusted and battered, its wooden handle splintered and rough. Next to it, dark stains marred the rocks, a deep, rusty red that looked eerily like blood. I felt my stomach lurch. I crouched down to examine the pickaxe, my pulse quickening. What had happened here? Where were the hikers? I glanced around, half expecting to see them emerge from the fog, but the mine stood silent, as if it had swallowed them whole. Despite my better judgment, I pressed on, stepping cautiously into the darkness. My flashlight beam flickered against the rough stone walls, illuminating jagged edges and damp patches. The mine seemed to stretch endlessly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence became deafening, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. As I walked deeper, I began to hear faint sound whispers, soft and ethereal, carried on the still air. I stopped, straining to listen, but the voices were too faint to make out. Were the hikers down here? Or was it just my mind playing tricks? I took a deep breath, shaking my head, trying to dismiss the sensation of unease that clung to me like the fog. The path ahead forked, and I chose the left tunnel, where the whispers seemed to beckon me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering ominously. I fumbled with the batteries, cursing softly, and when I looked up, I caught a shadow darting across the wall, quick and fleeting. I jumped back, my heart racing, but when I focused, I saw nothing but the shifting fog that clung to the mine walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes were tracking my every move from the darkness. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I stumbled into a small chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols carved deep into the stone, ancient, cryptic, and unsettling. I stepped closer, my curiosity battling with an instinctual fear. It felt like a warning, something meant to keep me from going further. The air felt charged, and just as I began to make sense of the markings, a loud bang echoed through the tunnel, making my heart jump. It sounded like a rock falling somewhere deeper inside the mine. Instinct kicked in. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but curiosity held me back, pulling me forward. I took a deep breath, pushing aside the fear clawing at my throat, and stepped further into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, no longer a soft murmur but an insistent call that sent chills racing down my spine. "Help us. Help us," the voices seemed to plead, their tones echoing eerily in the confined space. I moved deeper, feeling a compulsion I couldn't explain. The weight of the mine pressed down on me, and I felt disoriented as the shadows danced around the edges of my flashlight beam. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. Just then, the air shifted, and a cold breeze swept through the chamber, sending a wave of goosebumps across my skin. Then I saw them figures emerging from the swirling fog. My heart sank as I realized they were not just shadows. They were miners, their faces twisted and distorted, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. Their eyes were hollow, devoid of life, yet filled with a haunting sorrow. My breath caught in my throat as they turned to face me, their mouths moving in silent screams, as if trying to warn me or perhaps lure me deeper into the mine. "Stay with us," one of them whispered, the sound echoing like a distant wind through the chamber. My heart raced, terror gripping me as I took a step back, feeling the coldness of their presence wash over me. I wanted to run, but their ghostly forms seemed to hold me in place, a mix of fear and morbid fascination keeping me rooted to the spot. Then came the fog, thicker than before, swirling around me, wrapping around my legs like a living creature. Panic surged through me, forcing me to think of escape. I turned, desperation taking over as I stumbled back toward the tunnel, but it felt like the mine itself was shifting, the walls closing in, creating a maze I couldn't navigate. I scrambled, the whispers morphing into frantic cries, "Don't leave us! Don't leave us!" The shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, and I felt as if the darkness was alive, hungry for my fear. Finally, I burst through the mine's entrance, collapsing into the blinding light of day. The sun shone brightly overhead, the fog swirling ominously at the mine's mouth. I lay on the ground, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. The whispers faded, but I could still feel the weight of the miners' presence pressing down on me, their sorrow echoing in my mind. I struggled to put the experience behind me as I made my way back to my car, but the fog didn't just vanish. It followed me, lurking in the corners of my vision, creeping into my thoughts. I began to see it in random places in the morning mist on the way to work, in the thick air of early evenings. Every time I spotted it, I could hear the whispers, faint but persistent, just beneath the surface of my mind. I returned to the office, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I filed my report, detailing the pickaxe and the strange occurrences, but as I shared my experience with coworkers, I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They were skeptical, and I didn't blame them. Who would believe such a tale? I barely believed it myself. Days turned into weeks, and still, the fog haunted me. I would catch glimpses of it in the distance, always just out of reach, and it would send a shiver down my spine. I often found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the ghostly miners standing behind me, their twisted faces watching me, waiting for me to return. In the end, I never went back to the mine. The mystery of the missing hikers, the echoes of the past, and the haunting whispers stayed with me. I had stumbled upon something that day, something that defied explanation. I learned that some places are better left undisturbed, that some stories are meant to linger, much like the fog that clung to the hollow, forever obscuring the truth beneath. I never thought my job as an investigative journalist would lead me into the heart of darkness. I had covered missing persons, political scandals, and even the occasional ghost town, but nothing prepared me for the cold embrace of the catacombs beneath the historic New England town of Eldridge Hollow. It was 1990, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. My assignment seemed straightforward: at first investigate a series of strange deaths that had unsettled the community. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the old catacombs, whispering tales of a cult that once thrived in the shadows. They said the tunnels were used for dark rites and human sacrifice, but I brushed these off as mere folklore until I found myself standing at the entrance, a heavy iron gate creaking open, as if welcoming me into its depths. As I descended into the catacombs, the air grew colder, the walls damp and mossy. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the stone. I felt an unsettling chill creep down my spine, but tried to shake it off. After all, I was here to uncover the truth, to find out what had really happened to the victims. The locals had spoken of strange markings and blood-stained stones, of whispers echoing through the tunnels. With a notebook in hand, I pressed on, the sound of my footsteps echoing around me. At first it was quiet, too quiet. The silence enveloped me, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the stone ceiling. But then I heard it, a soft sound, almost like a whisper, curling around me like smoke. I paused, straining to listen. The whispering faded, replaced by the distant echo of footsteps that seemed to follow me deeper into the darkness. I convinced myself it was just the echoes of my own movements, but a knot of fear twisted in my stomach. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the environment became. The walls were adorned with crude symbols drawn in chalk, their meanings lost to time. I found blood-stained stones arranged in strange patterns, and the realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a place of burial, it was a place of ritual. My heart raced as I scribbled notes, feeling like I was uncovering something far more sinister than I had anticipated. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder this time, almost a chant, rising and falling like a dark hymn. My pulse quickened. I wanted to turn back, but the urge to uncover the truth pushed me forward. As I turned a corner, I came upon a small chamber filled with grotesque effigies made from sticks and scraps of fabric, resembling twisted human forms. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a stone. The chant grew louder, echoing through the chamber, sending waves of dread crashing over me. It was then that I saw them, figures cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured by animal masks. They emerged from the darkness, their movements fluid and eerie, surrounding me as they continued their chant. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures seemed to glide rather than walk, their chanting morphing into guttural sounds that reverberated off the stone walls. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. I sprinted back the way I had come, my breath coming in gasps as the whispers morphed into a cacophony of voices, each one urging me to stay, to join their dark celebration. The shadows danced at the edges of my vision, taunting me, as I stumbled through the passageways. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, that I was being led into a trap. Finally, I burst out into the open air, gasping as I scrambled up the stone steps, the weight of the catacombs lifting as I emerged into the cool night. I collapsed on the grass, heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had escaped, but as I lay there, the chill of the darkness clung to me, a ghost of the fear I had felt below. But even as I caught my breath, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed me. Shadows danced in the periphery of my vision, whispers lingered in my ears, echoing the chants I had heard beneath the ground. I glanced back at the entrance to the catacombs, the iron gate now closed tight, a sentry keeping its secrets hidden. A part of me wanted to return, to understand what I had encountered, but the fear of what lurked in the darkness held me back. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to return to normalcy, but I felt the shadows trailing behind me, lurking in the corners of my life. At night, I would hear whispers echoing through my apartment, soft yet insistent, as if beckoning me back to the catacombs. Friends would joke about my haunted experience, but they didn't understand I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. I kept researching the deaths, but every lead led me back to the same unsettling conclusion: the cult had never really disappeared. They were still there, lurking in the shadows of Eldridge Hollow, watching, waiting. And as much as I wanted to forget, a part of me knew that I had merely scratched the surface of something far more sinister. One evening, while thumbing through old town records, I came across a faded photograph of the catacombs. It showed a gathering of figures, cloaked in darkness, standing before a large stone altar. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the marking symbols I had seen etched into the walls. As I stared at the photograph, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the whispers began again, louder this time, echoing in my mind. It's been months since that night in the catacombs, but I still feel them, the unseen eyes watching, the whispers calling me back to the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever be free of the shadows, or if they will always be a part of me, waiting for the moment I decide to return to the catacombs where the whispers began. And as I sit here, I can't help but wonder what truly lies beneath the stone. What secrets do the shadows keep? The answers remain elusive, hidden in the darkness, just out of reach. It was 1988, and I was working as a local park ranger in Northern California, not far from an abandoned mental hospital that had a reputation. I'd heard the stories from other rangers, even hikers and campers, all swearing they'd seen strange lights flickering in the windows or heard faint whispers echoing from its crumbling walls. At first, I dismissed these tales as a mix of nerves and campfire lore, but the reports kept coming. The strangest part was that these accounts were strikingly similar. Hikers who claimed to have seen figures in the windows, campers who heard cries on the wind. Some said it was haunted by the tortured spirits of former patients who never left. I didn't think much of the place, honestly. It was a relic of another time, slowly swallowed by the woods. But one evening I got a call. A family of campers had reported seeing flickering lights from a distant ridge right where the old asylum sat. Again I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. I'd heard it all before, but something in the caller's voice made me pause. There was an edge of fear, the kind that didn't seem exaggerated. So, against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. It was nearing dusk as I pulled up to the asylum, parked the truck a little distance away, and took a deep breath. The building loomed ahead, half-eaten by shadows. Its windows were dark holes, empty and silent, staring out into the quiet forest. The place had an eerie stillness that only deepened as I approached. I started with a walk around the perimeter. Leaves crunched underfoot, but everything else was silent. There were no lights, no sounds, just the fading sunlight casting long, warped shadows. I was about to turn back when I heard something. A faint rustling from inside. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing down the empty halls through a broken window. Nothing. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. There was something off, something that made the hair on my arms prickle. It was like the air itself held a charge, buzzing just beneath the surface. Against every instinct, I stepped inside. The halls were just as desolate as they looked from outside, littered with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. Faded signs hung on walls and some doors were slightly ajar. The faint smell of mildew mixed with an old, metallic tang. A faint light caught my eye. Down a hallway, just barely visible, there was a glow pale and wavering. It didn't make any sense. No one had been in here for years, yet there it was. I moved closer, each step echoing off the walls. As I approached, I saw strange markings on the walls, scratched in with something sharp. They were crude symbols, like a child's attempt at drawing faces, all twisted and broken. And then I found the room where the light was coming from. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, empty office. A filing cabinet lay toppled on its side, and scattered across the floor were old patient records. Yellowed, brittle sheets filled with hasty, scrawled notes. I knelt down and picked one up. It was dated 1951 and described a patient with unsettling symptoms, delusions, violent tendencies, night terrors that couldn't be explained. My pulse quickened as I sifted through the records. Each patient's file was worse than the last, like every tortured soul had been funneled here, left to rot with their demons. And then I heard it again. A whisper, faint and unmistakable, drifting from somewhere just beyond the door. It was calling my name. I shot up, dropping the papers. My heart hammered as I backed out into the hallway. The whisper grew louder, becoming a soft chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering in ways that didn't match the dim light filtering through the broken windows. They were stretching, shifting, and taking on forms. Human shapes, all of them, reaching out from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. "Who's there?" I called out, but my voice felt small, swallowed up by the shadows. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The shadows moved closer, their shapes more defined now. They were figures human, but wrong. Their limbs twisted at impossible angles, faces blurred and hollow, and they were all staring at me, mouths moving as they whispered. "Leave," one voice said, louder than the rest. It sounded like a hiss, barely more than a breath. I stumbled back, but the shadows closed in, filling the hallway. They were surrounding me now, whispering, muttering names. Names I'd never heard but somehow recognized. Names that felt familiar, like an old memory I'd long forgotten. I could feel them behind me, brushing against my skin like cold tendrils. I bolted, my feet pounding down the hall as the voices followed, growing louder, more frantic. The shadows seemed to reach out, clawing at me as I fled. I didn't stop until I burst through the door and into the cold night air, gasping and shaking. When I looked back, the asylum was silent again, dark and still. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Who would believe me? But from that night on, something felt different. When I was alone, especially in the dark, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A shadow that lingered a little too long. Or a faint whisper that would send chills down my spine. And in every reflection, no matter where I was, I'd see them. Just for a moment, the twisted faces, hollow eyes, and mouths whispering names. Names I didn't know, but somehow I understood. They were still with me.
In the summer of 1989, I was a young investigator with the Forest Service, stationed out in northern Minnesota, miles away from the nearest town. Most people think my job was all about tree conservation and managing campsite permits. But sometimes we got calls that went beyond fires or poachers. That's how I ended up at Dark Lake. Dark Lake was buried in the middle of a dense, remote forest, so remote that even locals barely knew about it. But people had started to talk after some campers had gone missing there. The reports were always strange tents left standing, personal belongings scattered but untouched by animals, fire pits still warm. No sign of struggle, no sign of wildlife interference. Just empty campsites that looked like the people had walked off into the forest and never come back. The locals warned me before I even left. It's the lake lights, they said. You see them? You turn and walk the other way. There was this story about how, at night, strange lights would appear over the lake. Most folks thought it was just swamp gas or reflected starlight, but the people who'd spent their lives around that lake told it differently. They said the lights would drift over the water, and if you followed them, you'd disappear forever. I didn't believe in superstitions, but there was something unsettling about all the warnings. Still, I went out there alone, armed with a flashlight, a compass, and a map I'd drawn myself. The forest was unnervingly quiet as I hiked in. The trees were thick, their branches twisting above to blot out the sky. It felt as though the silence was pressing down on me, but I chalked it up to my nerves. I was nearly 2 hours in when I caught the first sign of something out of place at campsite, exactly where it was supposed to be on the map, but completely abandoned. The tent was still pitched, and a folding chair was set up by a cold fire pit. There were clothes strewn around, a half-opened backpack, and food left out in the open. It was as if whoever was here had just walked away. The only thing out of the ordinary was a small carved talisman lying by the tent. It looked like some kind of twisted face, carved out of wood and splashed with something red. I tried not to think about it too much. Maybe it was just some local's idea of a prank to scare people away. I left the talisman where it was and took a few photos for documentation. Then I kept moving toward the lake. The trees thinned out as I approached the water, and there it was, Dark Lake, just as black and still as the name suggested. I stood by the shore for a while, listening to the quiet. It was a calm evening, no breeze, no animals, not even a ripple on the water. But then, I saw them. Tiny, hovering lights started to appear over the lake's surface, small glows that pulsed in and out. They looked like stars, but there was something different about them, almost as if they were watching me. I should have turned back. The locals had been clear, and every instinct in me was screaming to leave. But I just stood there, frozen, watching as the lights drifted closer, one by one. Without realizing it, I had moved closer to the water. It was like the lights were pulling me in. The world around me faded as I focused on them, the little glimmers dancing just out of reach. Before I knew it, I was knee-deep in the cold, dark water, reaching out for them. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost like it was coming from inside my own head. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it was somehow familiar. It was saying my name. My heart pounded as I looked around, but there was no one there, just those lights. And the whispering, growing louder, insisting, come closer. That was when I snapped out of it. I stumbled back, scrambling up the shore as quickly as I could, and fell flat on my back. When I looked up, the lights had vanished, leaving the lake pitch black once more. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the dark sky, trying to catch my breath. But when I finally pulled myself up and looked back at the water, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the wet sand, leading directly into the lake, right from where I'd been standing. But here's the thing, they weren't my footprints. I left immediately, not looking back even once. By the time I made it back to my truck, dawn was breaking, and the first sounds of birds echoed through the trees. But even as I drove away, I felt something watching me from the forest's edge. I tried to put it behind me, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But the nights after that were different. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights had followed me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, cold and drenched in sweat, feeling like I was being pulled back to Dark Lake. It's been over 30 years, and I haven't gone back to that forest. But some nights when I close my eyes, I still see those lights hovering just